For my next book review, I thought I would choose a slightly lesser known novel. Well, slightly. For my next book review, I thought I would choose a slightly lesser known novel. Well, lesser known generally, not to literature people, I guess. The book is Passing by Nella Larsen, originally published in 1929, a story about a young black woman's experience with the practice of passing, which, if you don't already know, was when a lighter-skinned black person tried to pass as white by pretending to be a tan white person or making changes to their appearance for the same effect. This was a very controversial thing back in the 1920s, and was something that many members of the black community fighting tooth and nail for equality disdained. This was the time when the Harlem Renaissance was really picking up speed, and black pride was on the rise. Many were torn between thinking that people who tried to pass were betraying their own race, or pitying them for not having self-respect. Nella Larsen, who was herself mixed race, became interested in the emerging Harlem Renaissance a few years before publishing this book when she first moved to Harlem, and she had previously worked as a nurse and a librarian. She gave up her library job and took a sabbatical in order to write her first novel, titled Quicksand, which was published in 1928. Just in case you don't know, I'll give a short cultural background to the main theme of passing. In the US in the decades before the 1920s, there was a peculiar class structure in black society, something which was most easily seen in New Orleans, but it could also be found elsewhere. People who were part black, and thus having a lighter skin tone, generally received far better treatment than those with darker skin. In New Orleans, there was a whole class of people called Creoles, who had mixed African and French ancestry. They had effectively set themselves apart by defining themselves as being in a different category than darker-skinned black people. This included an emphasis on the arts, especially music, where most trained their children classically if they had the chance. This led to darker-skinned black people having separate theaters from Creoles, a sort of segregation within segregation. In other places, the disparity wasn't quite as large, but the difference in status was still noticeable. For example, Duke Ellington, who had relatively lighter skin and grew up in Washington, D.C., was raised to appreciate life's finer things and proper behavior, something that helped contribute to his image of sophistication. This practice of lighter-skinned black people separating themselves from their more oppressed, darker-skinned kin understandably caused resentment, since one group was clearly more privileged than the other. And this is where we enter the novel Passing. The main character is Irene Redfield, a relatively light-skinned black woman living in Harlem who is unashamed of her race. She happens to meet an old friend named Claire Kendry, also a light-skinned black woman. But the difference is that Claire has spent the last 12 years or so since they last saw each other successfully passing as white. At first, things are fine between the two, though Irene finds Claire's desire to pass a bit strange. Among the three women we see at the beginning, Irene, Claire, and Gertrude, who is a minor character, there is a spectrum of sorts represented. Irene is married to a black man, and neither she nor her husband has any qualms about their race. Gertrude is passing, but her white husband knows she's part black and wouldn't have been bothered if their children had darker skin, whereas Gertrude feared the possibility. Claire's relationship with her husband, Jack Bellew, is more than a bit strange. Jack doesn't know that Claire is part black, and during the get-together with Irene, Claire, and Gertrude, he shows up and proceeds to talk about how much he hates black people. He even has a pet name for Claire, which is just a shortened version of the N-word, because he jokingly says that she seems to be getting darker as time goes by. While Claire and Gertrude were with Irene, they start mockingly talking about a black man who converted to Judaism, because they found the idea of a black Jew going to synagogue regularly and growing out a beard and mustache to be humorous. This is when Irene snaps a little bit at them, saying that perhaps the man was earnest in his religious conversion and shouldn't be made fun of. This whole scene shows the irony of two black women, both of whom are passing, showing a cruel prejudice towards a darker-skinned individual for no apparent reason and exposing their privileged attitude. Something that, it is implied, a black woman unashamed of her race, like Irene believes herself to be, wouldn't do. Irene's attitude towards Claire shifts throughout the story. She's glad to have seen her again after so long, then she doesn't want to answer her calls. She doesn't want to answer the door when Claire comes, but is happy to see her when she does. She really can't seem to make up her mind throughout the entire novel. Claire's passing makes her uncomfortable, but she is also strangely drawn to it. Claire starts to become interested in associating with black people again, something she hasn't done for a very long time. And Irene for some reason starts to think that her own husband, Brian, is having an affair with her, perhaps thinking that he thinks Claire is more beautiful because she has lighter skin. Later on, Claire's husband, Jack Bellew, sees Irene holding hands with a more obviously black woman, and the encounter is extremely awkward. Irene realizes that the man has most likely put the pieces together that his wife is not white. But Irene doesn't tell Claire about this, even knowing that her marriage would be ruined and her daughter's life made more difficult. Because if Claire and her husband divorce, that could lead her own husband to leave her for Claire. But again, there isn't really any evidence of an affair except in Irene's imagination. Claire, Irene, and Brian all go to a house party at a friend's house. The party is interrupted when Mr. Bellew shows up and angrily shouts at Claire that he knows she's black. Claire then falls or is pushed out of a window, the exact details are never given, and she dies. Irene thinks about the idea of passing, and the contradictory way black society views it. In a very enlightening passage, she says, "It's funny about passing. We disapprove of it and at the same time condone it. It excites our contempt, and yet we rather admire it. We shy away from it with an odd kind of revulsion, but we protect it." Brian, however, just passes it off as being the instinct of the race to survive and expand. Irene becomes a bit frustrated at this comment. His cold, broadly scientific explanation is in sharp contrast to her passionate emotion at the whole thing. Irene seems to embody her thoughts about the contradictory views about people who pass. She keeps telling herself that she won't contact or reply to Claire ever again, but she always finds herself warmly accepting her again. Once, after Irene tears up a letter from her, Claire comes to her house. Even with the chance to ignore her, she doesn't, and she frequently mentions how beautiful Claire is. And in the beginning of the story, Irene was sitting on the roof of the Drayton Hotel, nervous that a woman, who turned out to be Claire, would find out that she was black. This shows that while Irene strongly believes that there's nothing wrong with her race and she isn't ashamed of it, in practice, it affects her more than she seems to realize. This example also shows that Irene herself is willing to pass if the opportunity arises. Of course, she doesn't go fully in, but she's a middle-class woman who wants to live a middle-class lifestyle, with a certain degree of respectability that goes with it. She also passes if it prevents a situation from becoming uncomfortable or dangerous. She even admitted this when she said, "I don't believe I've ever gone native in my life except for the sake of convenience, restaurants, theater tickets, and things like that. Never social, I mean, except once." She passes when Claire's racist husband joins the group of 3 women, and he is completely unaware that all of them are actually passing. Knowing his strong opinions on black people, Irene probably passed to avoid a confrontation, though she also got a kick out of the irony as well. Irene, in explaining why white women want to dance with black men at an event in Harlem, unconsciously reveals something about herself, at least I think so. Here's the quote. "I think that what they feel is, well, a kind of emotional excitement. You know, the sort of thing you feel in the presence of something strange, and even perhaps a bit repugnant to you. Something so different that it's really at the opposite end of the pole from all your accustomed notions of beauty. And I know colored girls who've experienced the same thing. The other way round, naturally." It sounds eerily similar to her overall view of Claire, don't you think? Except, of course, for the fact that she's not actually white, it shows that Irene is fascinated by Claire and her situation. Certainly, she finds some of it repugnant, but she's also stricken by her beauty, which, again, she mentions a lot. The tension on the matter of race with Claire spills over into Irene's personal life, too. She and her husband, Brian, get into a heated discussion about how and when to teach their sons about lynching. Brian opts to be blunt and tell them early on so they can find out what they're up against as soon as possible. Irene, on the other hand, believes that they should wait until the children are older and preserve their innocence so that they can be happy and not have such ugly things on their minds when they're so young. She later says that the most important thing in her life is security. This is why she is willing to pass. This is why she knows that she will always have Brian as long as they have their sons, despite her suspicions of his possible affair with Claire. And her need for security is why she doesn't want her sons knowing about racism yet. But as Brian reminds her, their sons have already experienced racism, when one of them was called the dirty N-word. But Irene skips over that important detail and stands her ground, continuing to argue in favor of preserving an innocence that is no longer there. I think that this really runs parallel with Irene's denial about Claire, race, and passing. Just before this argument, Irene had reached a psychological breaking point. And this is the extended quote from the narrator that sheds some light on her mental state at that time, and why she is clinging so desperately onto that last shred of her previous principles. For the first time, she suffered and rebelled because she was unable to disregard the burden of race. It was, she cried silently, enough to suffer as a woman, an individual, on one's own account, without having to suffer for the race as well. It was a brutality, and undeserved. Surely no other people so cursed as Ham's dark children. Claire seems to personify the practice of passing, and Irene represents the average black or mixed-race American at that time. Like Irene, they might disdain the practice in theory, opting instead to seek pride in their race rather than cover it up. But there's just something about being able to be seen as white that had its temptations, whether it was increased self-worth or the greater opportunities it offered in such a discriminatory society. Nella Larsen confronted a difficult and complex issue head-on, perhaps even saying that these subconscious thoughts are natural, though she doesn't condone acting on them per se. And Claire's presence puts a strain on Irene's relationship with her husband, so those thoughts, and passing in general, are portrayed as being extremely toxic and liable to tear apart the human psyche. Overall, this book is very interesting. The writing is very fluid and very modern. There's also a lot of depth to it, not just about race either. Irene's overall psychology is very complex and nuanced, and can definitely be explored very deeply. Because of the short length, it's a good book to read between two longer books, at least that's what I did. As I've said before, I'm not a professional book reviewer, so these are just a collection of my random thoughts and first impressions, so feel free to start a discussion in the comments about any of the points I talked about or anything I left out. I know this video wasn't entirely comprehensive, but I'm hoping that it's enough to make someone want to read the book themselves. So that's all I have to say, for now at least. This book is pretty short, it's more of a novella than a novel, so that's why this was shorter than my other book reviews. But people have written very detailed theories and opinions about this book, I'm sure. It's one of the best pieces of literature to come out of the Harlem Renaissance, and Nella Larsen was clearly a very talented writer. She just didn't produce a large body of work, unfortunately. So yeah, I would definitely recommend reading Passing. I might come back to it eventually since I got a collection of other 1920s Harlem Renaissance novels for Christmas, and I might want to do something with all of them together, but I don't know yet. Also, just a quick mention that a film based on this novel and with the same title was released in 2021, and I think it's on Netflix. So, yet another 1920s story being adapted into a film. It's been a pretty common theme in the last couple of years, it seems, which is great, of course. Well, anyway, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.